Hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Um, I'm hoping that this will be a helpful video on grief that we can talk about together. So I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Dr. Taslim Alani-Verjee, and I am the founder and director of Film Center for Mental Health. So today we're going to be talking about understanding and managing grief. Now, this has been a new time for so many of us. I'm going to put my headphones in, just in case you can't hear me that well. I'm hoping that this is a little bit better. So today we're going to be talking about managing and understanding grief. Now, we're talking about grief right now because there have been a lot of changes going on in our society today. And so in understanding grief and learning how to manage it better, this is stuff that we can apply all of the time. But specifically within the context of COVID-19, I thought that it would be helpful for us to explore what is grief, how do people experience grief, and what can we do with it. The goal is never to make grief go away because it doesn't go away. We can't force it away. And when we try to, we usually end up getting ourselves into a bit of a tricky situation. And so it's not about making it go away. Rather, it's about figuring out what we can do with it and how we can process it in healthy and manageable ways. So let's start by what is grief. Grief is the natural response to loss. This isn't just death, but any kind of loss that we might experience. So we can grieve for a lot of different things. We can grieve the loss of a relationship. We can grieve the death of a loved one. We can grieve our life just changing overall. We can also grieve during happy times. So for example, when we're really excited to get married, we might also grieve the life of singlehood that we had before. And so it's not necessarily that grief always comes with bad things. Grief sometimes just comes with change, whether it's positive change or negative change. It's the emotional experience we have when something we cared for has been taken away. And this might have been something that was within our control and we chose, and sometimes it's something that's not within our control. Usually it's the things that are taken from us without our control that end up being a little bit harder to grieve, but the more complicated ones are often the situations in which we chose the change, because then we're left sitting with both our choice and the negative repercussions of that. And so being able to balance those things can be quite challenging. Now, many of us may have heard about the cycle of grief or the stages of grief, and this was established by a researcher known as Kubler-Ross. And so she walks us through the different stages of grief. And I thought it would be helpful today to really explore what those stages of grief are and how we experience different things during those stages of grief. It's important to recognize that even though it is a cycle, it's not a cycle in which we will go through each of the stages in a specific order. Rather, a lot of people bounce around all of them. It's also possible that people won't experience anything in the cycle at all, or that they'll experience just two or three of the things in the cycle. And so everyone's experience of grief is different, and there is no one right way to experience that grief. However, according to research, most people do experience it in some kind of order, bouncing around, and most people do experience all of the stages of grief. So I just want to put that out there so that as you are going through your experiences of grief, and I imagine most of us right now are experiencing some kind of grief, then we can actually take some time to reflect on what is going on, why are we feeling these emotions, and what can we do about them? Again, remembering that the goal is never for them to go away because we cannot force emotions away, but rather how can we process them, and understand what our minds are trying to tell us about them. So the first known stage of grief is denial. And this is the first stage that initially helps us survive the loss. Most people tend to think that denial is a way of rejecting reality, and it is exactly that. We're not living in actual reality when we're in the denial stage. We're living in a preferable reality, one that doesn't acknowledge the change that we've experienced. However, that denial and that shock can actually help us cope with the loss that we're experiencing. And the reason why is because it protects us. It protects us from feeling all of the emotions of grief at once. And so when we deny what's happening, when we deny the reality, we close ourselves off, we pretend like it's not happening, or we really, really believe that it's not happening. And then slowly, as our denial moves away and we begin to really acknowledge the reality of the situation, the other emotions start to come up. But they come up slowly because we're wavering between denial and acknowledgement of the reality. And so it's this slow, gradual movement towards acceptance of reality that can help us to experience it more totally without getting too overwhelmed or impaired by it. So that's the first stage, denial. The second stage of grief is the anger stage. And it's common to think, why me? Or life is not fair during this stage. We might even look to blame others or even ourselves during this stage. We might notice ourselves asking questions like, what if? Or wondering, what if? What if I had left the house just 5 minutes earlier? What if I wouldn't have accepted this new wonderful job? What if I wouldn't have got married? What if I would have checked in on this person sooner? All of these questions might come up in our minds, and it's a way of us being able to target the anger that we're experiencing. We're really channeling and trying to make sense of what's going on. When we experience anger, this is a way of us being able to start to connect with the reality of the situation. And we might notice ourselves redirecting some of that anger towards family and towards friends. If we believe in God or a higher power, we may even direct some of that towards that higher power or to God, simply because something has happened that has hurt us, right? That's what grief is. It's something that's hurt us. And so our reaction can be one that is of anger. However, that anger is actually quite important, and researchers and mental health professionals agree that it's a very important stage for us to experience and acknowledge. And so it's not about shutting our anger away or not expressing it, not experiencing it. Many of us may have been raised to believe that anger is an inappropriate emotion, but that's not at all the case. Instead, we should really try to experience the anger, because it's the anger that helps us connect with our emotions. It helps us connect with the reality of the situation, and it also helps us connect with people again. Not always in the most positive ways, but it's a beginning stage. The next stage is bargaining, and this is through negotiation. So we might experience well, if I change this, then maybe this will happen. We might have even noticed ourselves bargain with God before of, if I do X, Y, and Z, then God, will you do A, B, and C for me? This is the bargaining that takes place. Please bring this person back, or if I'm good, but bring this person back. Or if I work harder next time, maybe I won't have to deal with this loss that I've experienced. And so we negotiate. And this is making an effort or an attempt at gaining some sort of normality back in our lives. However, even with that, this is still not quite accepting the reality of the situation. The next stage is known as depression. And this can look like a clinical depression, but it can also look like sadness. And so we'll talk a little bit later about the difference between grief and depression. However, this stage is called depression. And so this is a very commonly accepted form of grief. And when people are mourning a loss, usually the tears, the sadness, the withdrawal, this is what we see in the depression stage. Most people associate depression immediately with grief, because a lot of the time when we're experiencing depression, we're reacting to something in the moment. And so we're acknowledging that something has been lost. There's a sadness there, and therefore we are grieving. It represents the emptiness that we feel when we've lost something, and especially when we can't get that something back. And so it's a sadness that we experience. And in this stage, we may notice ourselves withdrawing from people or from things that we love or that we enjoy doing. We may notice ourselves in a bit of a fog, not being able to think clearly. We may notice ourselves having low energy, not being able to get out of bed. We may be going more towards comfort foods during this time. And these are all appropriate ways of dealing with this stage and dealing with grief. The world might seem too much or like it's too overwhelming during this stage. And then the last stage of grief is acceptance. And it is in this stage that our emotions begin to stabilize. So we are re-entering reality during this period, and we are coming to terms with our new reality, as uncomfortable as it is.
It's not that we are okay with what has happened, but that we accept it as something that did happen. And so we can see that this is quite different than the bargaining stage or the denial stage where we're still trying to change the reality. In acceptance, we know that it has happened and we may still be unhappy about it, but we're no longer trying to change the reality. During this stage, we may start to experience more good days, days where we feel like we do have energy, where we do want to engage with people. We may also notice ourselves fluctuating of good days and bad days, but hopefully the goal is that we'll end up having more good days than we are having bad days. Eventually, we might start to even engage with people again, and we may start to have more clear thinking. And eventually, we might be able to understand that whatever we've lost can never be replaced. We can't get it back. We can't go back to an old time, but we move, we grow, and we evolve into our new reality. Now, when we talk about this within the context of COVID-19, we may be hearing a lot of, I just want things to go back to the way they were, or things to go back to normal. However, it's important to acknowledge that when a change happens in our life, there is no going back. And even though we wish sometimes that we could go back, there's no back in time for us. We don't have a time machine. Um, and we evolve as people. We are no longer the people we were now that we were back then. And our communities are no longer what they were. And so it's not about going back in time, but rather about moving forward, about evolving, and about trying to find a new form of normal. I wanted to walk us through a few myths about grief. And these are common myths. And so just wanted to address them. And in the chat box, if you'd like, feel free to acknowledge if this is something you have experienced before or even something that you've heard others say before. So, one, that the pain will go away fast if we ignore it. If we ignore the pain, if we numb ourselves from the pain will go away faster. This is a myth. Trying to ignore or force our pain away will actually make it worse in the long run. For real healing, it's necessary to face our grief and actively deal with it. We might think even about a breakup, right? When we experience the loss of the end of a relationship, it can be really hard for so many of us. And so we may choose to ignore the pain, to just kind of go on or dive into something that keeps us occupied during that time. However, when we don't acknowledge it and we don't actually deal with it, it usually creeps into other parts of our life in more complicated ways and in ways that are harder to deal with. And so the best thing to do is to deal with it in the moment as we're experiencing it, as opposed to forcing it away. The second myth is that it's important to be strong in the face of loss. And this is not the being strong of faith or the having courage. It's more about being not acknowledging feelings, and that's the myth, right? That we don't need to be strong or be tough in the face of loss. We are allowed to feel all of our emotions, feeling sad, frightened, lonely. These are all normal reactions to loss. Crying does not mean that we are weak, and this again is something that we may have heard throughout our lives, that we ought not to show tears, we ought not to show weakness. But crying is not weakness. Grief is not weakness. It's just how we feel. And the more that we can acknowledge that, the stronger we end up being, because it takes so much courage to experience those emotions, and we build resilience along the way. Showing our true emotions can help us feel more normal, can help us feel like we're on our way to healing, and can also be a way of showing others that it's okay to experience the wide range of emotions. Myth number 3, if we don't cry, it means that we aren't sad or sorry about the loss. Now, this may also be something that we've heard before, or when we go to a funeral, or when we see that someone ought to be sad about a loss and they're not crying, that people automatically judge them and say, well, that person must not be sad enough, or that person must not care about the loss that they've experienced. And this often is extremely judgmental. There is no right way to grieve. There is no right way to demonstrate sadness. And I see that there's a question here: is there a wrong way to grieve? And I'll get to the questions later on. But for now, there is no right way to grieve, which means there is no wrong way to grieve either. It's just about being able to experience everything that we're experiencing. And if that means that you're crying and you're sad, that's okay. If it means that you're wailing and screaming, that's okay. If it means that you're quiet, not showing any emotion at all, that's still okay. The more we can channel our emotions, the more we can express and experience our emotions, the better it is for the grieving process. But not all of us experience and express emotions in the same way. And it means nothing about how we're feeling towards the loss that we are experiencing. Another myth is that grieving should last about a year. Right? People say this, that, by the end of a year, I should feel better. Things should be back to the way they were before. This is a myth. There is no specific time frame for grieving. Some people take a really long time. Some people are feeling better by the next day. And it doesn't mean anything about the seriousness of the loss or how sad that they are, or how significant the loss was. We all just take different amounts of time and we deal with things in different ways. And there may be some losses that we can overcome and manage and process more easily, and other losses that are going to be very hard for us. There is no specific time frame on this. The last myth I wanted to address is that moving on with our life means that we are forgetting about our loss. And this can be a fear for so many people, that the moment we carry on with our lives, that we move forward in whatever way that looks, means that we're not really taking the loss seriously, that we've forgotten the significance of the person or the thing in our lives, or that we don't care anymore about them. But this is not the case at all. Moving on means that we've accepted the loss. It still might not be that we're okay with it, and it's definitely not the same thing as we've forgotten it. Rather, it just allows us to move forward with our lives and yet keep the memory of what we've lost with us, because it can still be an important part of us. This still means that we're allowed to have new relationships. We're allowed to connect with others. We're allowed to have positive memories and experiences in our lives, and yet keep the memory of the person with us. We don't forget when we accept. We don't forget when we move on. And these memories can actually become more integral to our well-being when we allow ourselves to move forward with our lives. So these are some of the myths. And at the end of this webinar, if you've heard of other myths or you want to ask questions about whether something is right or wrong, feel free to put it in the chat box. So now that we've talked a little bit about grief, the stages of grief, why we experience it, and some of the myths, and how all of us experience it differently, I wanted to address some of the ways that we can take care of ourselves while grieving. Again, the goal is never to eliminate the grief or to make it go away, because like we've talked about, if we ignore it, it actually makes it more complicated. And when we try to tough it out, it actually makes it more complicated as well. And so it's really about allowing ourselves to feel, and not pushing away, not trying to make it go away. So the first thing that we can do is acknowledge our pain. Obviously, this is really hard because no one likes to feel pain. However, when we can acknowledge our hurt, acknowledge the loss, and acknowledge the pain, then we can allow ourselves to sit with it, to tolerate it, without it controlling our lives. We are acknowledging that this is something that we are grieving, that this is something that we've lost, and that we are okay, but we don't feel okay right now. So it's important to acknowledge the pain that we are experiencing. We can also accept that grief may trigger a lot of different emotions and a lot of unexpected emotions. Many times people feel relief when they lose something that they've loved. And that's not because they didn't care or because they don't want the person back or what they've lost back, but rather because maybe the person was suffering, or maybe it was really, really hard to endure it in its last moments. And so whatever our emotions, as complicated as they are, as varied as they are, they can be unexpected. And we should acknowledge that that's probably going to be part of our process. We may feel a handful of emotions at the same time, and that is okay. There is no right or wrong way. And usually people, when they're grieving, experience a lot of different emotions. And so be ready for what is unexpected, and be ready for it to be extremely complex and diverse in its emotional experience, because that's just how it goes sometimes. The other thing we can do is to understand that our grieving process will be unique to us. So there's no sense in comparing. This is also something that we often see where, some people are having a harder time than others. There may be someone who barely knew the person who's passed and yet is extremely sad, visibly sad, crying. And yet you, who may have known them your whole life or for the majority of your life, are sitting there and stoic. There's no sense in comparing. We all experience emotions in different ways. And so as you experience your emotion, don't look at other people and wonder why they're experiencing it that way. Don't judge it. And in the same way, if you're noticing judgments against you or you're wondering whether you should be doing it in a certain way, let that go. The more layers we add to our emotional experience, the harder it gets. And so instead of wondering, am I doing this right? Or should I be doing it this way? Just let yourself have the experience. Let yourself totally and fully experience all of the emotions and know that what you're experiencing, how you're expressing it, what you're thinking and what you're feeling is going to be different than everyone else. And that is okay. That's the way it's meant to be. We can also seek out support from people who care about us. Now, this too can be pretty complicated sometimes because when we're grieving, others, usually our support system, will be part of that grieving party as well, either grieving because we've lost something that we love or because they've also lost something that they love or someone that they love. And so when we seek out support, it's important to acknowledge that yes, people want to be there for us, and they might not have the capacity or the resources to be there for us in the way that we need. And so one of the things that we can do is try to be strategic about who we're choosing to support us and in what ways, right? If someone is likely just as sad as we are, they may or may not be the right person to go to for certain types of support. And so being able to be strategic is helpful so that we can set ourselves up for success. The other thing to try to do when seeking out support is to really think about what kind of support we need. Now, there's a bit of a stereotype that when we're experiencing loss, people will bring things like casseroles to us, bring food to us, call and check in. And for some of us, that's fantastic. That's exactly what we need. And for others, we don't really want to have to talk about how we're feeling. We don't really want to have to answer the door. We're fine with the food, and all we want to do is eat takeout and ice cream, and that's okay. And so when you're reaching out for support, let people know what you need. Let people know how to support you so that you can get the kind of support that's going to really help you. Because at the end of the day, when people are reaching out to you, they want to be helping. That's why they're doing that. But if they don't know how, we may notice ourselves feeling frustrated with their approach of support. And they are probably noticing that we're not really enjoying their support. We're not feeling supported through their support strategies. And so being able to let people know what you need is a really helpful thing to do. Now, this may feel a little bit awkward because when people are trying to help us, we may not want to dictate the approach in which they do that. However, the more we can get practice in asking people for what we need, we're not demanding, we're not ordering, but we're asking from people who we know, love, and care about us to support us in a certain way. The easier this gets, the more supported we feel, and overall, the better our well-being, not just during grief, but in all parts of our life. And the last thing that we can do to increase our well-being is to take care of ourselves physically so that we can support ourselves emotionally. When we're experiencing stress, when we're experiencing loss, one of the first things to go is our self-care. And this is not the bubble baths and baking self-care. This is the keeping ourselves well self-care, the eating, the showering, the making sure we're getting some sort of physical activity, the taking of medications. We can lose all of these things in times of stress and in times of sadness. And it is these same things that keep us feeling well. They usually at least keep us at some sort of baseline. And so what we want to try to do is to maintain that physical self-care, even when our emotional self-care isn't going that great, because that keeps us at least feeling at somewhat of a baseline well. And so make sure, no matter the stress, no matter the distress, no matter the loss and the sadness, the anger, the frustration, try to do the things that help keep you physically well so that you at least have a little bit of capacity to manage the emotional experiences that come along with grief. What happens when we don't take care of ourselves physically is we actually end up being a little bit more dysregulated. Imagine a night where you didn't get any sleep. That following day probably wasn't the best day for decisions. Or the nights where maybe you eat too much sugar. I know this happens to me. I'm not the best version of myself because I notice my emotions are going up and down, right? And so when we can eat well, when we can sleep well, when we can take care of ourselves physically, that allows our emotional regulation to be just a little less overwhelming, which is likely what we're looking for when we're experiencing intense emotions. So these are ways that we can take care of ourselves. But then there's also the how do we feel grief? What can we do to actually allow ourselves to feel and to process and to make sense of the grief? And there are 3 strategies that we can try to use. The first is to mark the loss in ways that are meaningful for us. And so it might be about having some sort of gathering with people, funerals and all of the rites and ceremonies that come along with the loss of a person can usually be helpful. Right now in these circumstances, we're probably not doing a whole lot of that, but there might still be ways to acknowledge some of it. Does your family or your culture have certain traditions around food when there is a loss? Or are there certain prayers that you can engage in when there is a loss? Is there some sort of ceremony that you can do that you've done before when there was a loss? All of these things can help, but it's important to really mark the loss, to acknowledge it, and to do something that feels meaningful to you to acknowledge that the loss has happened. The second strategy is to remember and remember what we've lost, right? Now, it may feel a little bit awkward to do this as well. And there might be some belief that when we try to hold on to what we've lost, that we're interrupting the grief process, but this is not at all the case. Remembering can help us feel experiences of love, of peace, and we can even experience laughter. And so being able to write about, think about, talk about what we've lost, all of this will help us remember, make sense of, and really honor what we've lost and what that meant to us. Now, if we silence ourselves during this process, then there really is no way of acknowledging just how hard that loss has been for us. And so remembering and remembering and remembering can be helpful. Now, if you notice that you are just thinking about what you've lost and about nothing else, this may be a sign of problematic grieving, and we'll talk about that as well. But being able to take some time out to remember, to acknowledge, all of that can help us in our grieving process. It can help us feel a sense of comfort. It can help us feel a sense of peace, of love, and of wisdom. And the last strategy is to give ourselves permission to feel positive emotions. When we are grieving, it may feel wrong to have moments of laughter or to have moments of fun or enjoyment, but this is okay. There is no reason why we cannot experience positive emotions even when we are sad, even when we are grieving, even when we are angry or frustrated. Remember that our emotions, especially during grief, can be extremely complicated and extremely varied, right? And so we may have moments where we laugh about something, and that laugh may or may not be inappropriate, and that's still okay. But we can also have moments of enjoyment. We can watch our favorite movie. We can eat our favorite meal. We can be with the people that we love or connect with the people that we love. And we can take moments to not have to think about what we've lost. These are all acceptable, and they're actually part of our grieving process. And so by withholding that, we actually make it more complicated because, again, we are judging it. And I've experienced this with a lot of clients who are mad at themselves or are feeling guilty because they're having moments of joy or of laughter when they're really sad. But there's nothing wrong with it. There is no book that tells us that when we are sad, we are only allowed to be sad and nothing else. And so remember, positive emotions are extremely helpful. So one of the questions here is there a wrong way to grieve? like I said before, there is no wrong way to grieve. However, it is also important to recognize that grieving may become problematic. And so grieving can be problematic when all we are doing is thinking about what we've lost. Now, we may see this for the first little while after we've lost something, but when it's holding us back from being able to engage in our daily activities, when all we can think about is what we have lost, when we're no longer feeling like ourselves because of what we have lost, this may be time to seek out some professional help. And it may not necessarily be a mental health professional. It may be a clergy person, a person of faith, but just trying to make sense of the loss and the way that we're dealing with it can be helpful. And so if you notice that it's taking up so much of your time and so much of your space that you cannot move on, then this is probably a good time to seek out some of that professional support. The other thing is that sometimes we may experience really, really intense emotions. And of course, this is okay. There is no right or wrong way to feel. But when our emotions are so intense that we feel overwhelmed by them, we don't know how to express them, and we may actually end up doing things that harm us or harm other people, this is also a good time to reach out for professional help. One of the things that we can try to do is to bring ourselves back to a normal or regulated emotional level. And so it might be about taking breaks, time to ourselves to kind of just unwind and recognize where we're at, engaging in deep breathing so that we can relax our bodies and relax our minds. And then checking in with ourselves. Are we eating well? Are we sleeping as well as we can be? Are we trying to maintain some sort of schedule? All of that stuff can help us to experience less emotional dysregulation. So being able to notice, are my emotions too extreme? The other thing that's unhelpful to grieving is numbing. And we talked about that before, and I just wanted to spend a little bit more time on it because a lot of the time we try to avoid all of the ugly emotions, right? The ones we don't want to feel, they don't feel good. They're not nice to experience. The pain, the sadness, the frustration, the anger, the grief, all of it. It's unpleasant. It's meant to be unpleasant. But when we feel like we can't tolerate the unpleasantness or we just want it to go away, we may engage in certain behaviors that end up being unhelpful. So this can be things like alcohol or substance use. It may be things like self-harm. It may be things like using food to emotionally regulate ourselves. Now, in moderation, some of these things can be okay. But often they actually just end up interrupting our grieving process. And so the more that we can try to sit with our emotions, to just let ourselves feel them and know that our emotions can never hurt us. They're just emotions. It's like our thoughts. Our thoughts can never hurt us. They are just thoughts. So when we can really acknowledge that we are okay even if we don't feel okay, and even though we're thinking something, it doesn't mean it's true or that it's a fact. All of this can protect us. That trying to numb ourselves or trying to force the emotions away through making changes within ourselves, all of that just makes the grief process a lot more complicated and a lot harder to deal with in the long term. So I'd like to end it there and open it up for some questions in case anyone has any. So I'll just give it a few seconds here as I prepare the final slide with our contact information. Okay, so I see some questions here, which is great. I'm just going to share this final slide. Okay, okay. So one question here is, what does it mean if it's taking me a really long time to grieve? Is there something wrong with me? That's a great question. there is no right amount of time for us to grieve. And what that grief process will look like over time will likely vary as well, right? And so we might notice ourselves kind of bouncing around those stages of grief. We might notice that we came to some sort of acceptance and then we've learned new information. Or we were at a certain process within our grief and then we learned new information. All of these things can make us last longer in that grief process. And even when we are finally okay, we finally accepted it, it doesn't mean we won't still have moments of sadness, moments of anger, moments where we experience loss. And so there is no right amount of time. Now, again, if you notice that you're not feeling well, that the grief is getting in the way of you engaging in your everyday life, it's probably worth seeking out supports from a professional to just understand what's going on with your grief. Has your grief process been interrupted by something? Is something getting in the way of you being able to come to some form of acceptance? All of that can be discussed with the mental health professional, but know that there is no right or wrong way. And so if you notice yourself wondering, well, it's been a year or it's been 2 years, this should be over, I shouldn't be thinking about this anymore, that's simply not true. That's not the way grief works. Okay, another question. How can one move from denial to acknowledging grief in a gentle way? So usually this is a bit of a natural process. When we're in denial, what's happening is, like I said, our body is protecting us, our emotions and our mind are protecting us. Now, when we're ready to start acknowledging some of the reality of that situation, then we will gradually just move into acknowledging the grief. Now, what might happen is that we are so much in denial that we cannot accept the reality. However, most of the time, the reality of the situation is staring us in the face, right? The person that we love is no longer in front of us. The place we used to live, the places we used to go, we can't go there anymore. And so it's not so much that we need to force ourselves into being able to acknowledge the loss, because it's a significant loss, which means we're probably going to notice it pretty quickly. And so usually we don't need to force it or tug it along. And so this is important to acknowledge as well. However, if you notice for a loved one that they are stuck in denial, being able to have conversations with them about how they're even feeling, right? It doesn't even need to be about accepting or acknowledging the reality of the situation. Even being able to acknowledge their emotional process is a good first step. Having people talk about their emotions allows them to start to experience them a little bit more fully, without shame, without guilt, and without fear. There's another question here. How do we deal with people who encourage us to just focus on the positive and try to move on? Now, this happens a lot, right? When we are sad, people tell us to look on the bright side of things. They tell us, you'll get through this. Everything's going to be okay. This was meant to be. And sure, all of that is true, but in those moments, that's probably not what we need to be hearing. And so being able to let people know what we need from them is really helpful. Now, we can't necessarily make people change their narrative. And usually when people are telling us this, it's their way of making themselves more comfortable in the situation. And so acknowledging that this is their way of coping and their way of supporting us can be a good first step. And maybe we can find some compassion and be able to say something like, I know that you're trying to be really helpful right now, and I'm so grateful for that. But what I need right now is to just feel sad, and I'm okay with just feeling sad. Or if you do need something, to just say, you know what, this is what I need from you. And when you tell me to just focus on the positive, I don't get to feel my sadness, and that's what I really feel right now. And so being able to acknowledge that the person's probably trying to be helpful doesn't dismiss them or their efforts, but yet also provides a platform for you to share what you really need and what you're really feeling in that moment. There's another question here. What about the concept that time will heal us? Is that a total myth, or is there some truth to that? I think that's, time heals us in that grieving does take time, right? But it's not the time in and of itself. Time doesn't magically fix things. We need to actively engage in the process. We need to actively connect with our emotions, think through our emotions, process the loss that we've experienced, that is what will heal us. Now, for some of us, that takes time, and for others, it happens, within an hour. There's nothing wrong with either of those strategies, but it's really not the time that's making us feel better. It's the process of making sense of the loss, of coming to acceptance of the loss. That is what will heal us. And usually that process takes time, but it's not a passive one. Another question here: how can I shift my mindset from focusing on the grief and sadness so that I can focus on the happy memories and be grateful for what I do have versus what I've lost? That's a great, great question. One of the things that we can try to do is to start a journal. To start a journal of all of the positive memories we've had. And this is not to force happiness on us, but it's rather to acknowledge that there can be some positivity in this. It's still sad. Loss is sad. But being able to remember that even in that sadness, the sadness comes because we loved, right? That's why we experience grief so intensely, is because we loved so intensely. So take some time, make space for that love, and make space for everything that we are experiencing, including the positive memories. So documenting those positive memories, going through pictures of happy memories, visiting happy places if that's possible, all of that can bring back some of those positive memories. The other thing that we can try to do is to think about what we've learned. What did that last thing that we've lost what has it taught us, right? Whether it's a person, whether it's an event in our life, whether it's an old job, it doesn't matter. We learn from every single experience that we have, and we learn from every interaction that we have. So to be able to think back on what we've learned, what we've taken away, how we've grown, that can allow us to feel a sense of gratitude for that experience, even though it's currently hurting us right now, even though it's currently bringing us sadness right now. So actively engaging in remembering and actively engaging in a practice of gratitude can be helpful. And if that feels too hard, the other thing that we can try to do is practice gratitude for the right now. So are there things that we are grateful for right now, even though we are grieving, even though we are sad? And so this might be things like, I am grateful that I have yogurt in the fridge. I am grateful that I have a roof over my head. I am grateful that I still have employment. I'm grateful that I still have family that I can call upon when I need something. They might not be huge, and that's okay, right? I'm grateful that I have this really soft, comfortable blanket to wrap myself around me while I cry, right? Whatever it is, noticing gratitude and practicing gratitude in the moment can also help shift our mindset. And again, it's not about forcing the mindset, but rather to allow space for the multitude of emotions. Because when we only focus on some of them, we're still ignoring part of them, which is still ignoring part of the grieving process. So I haven't had any questions for a couple of minutes. And so I will just talk a little bit about SILM Center for Mental Health and what we're doing right now. So right now what we're trying to do is support members of the community through offering mental health services. So we're still open. We're seeing clients virtually, so through phone or through video right now. And we've also opened several sliding scale and pro bono spots because we know that people are having a hard time right now. People are grieving right now. People are experiencing significant changes in their lives. And so if you are looking for professional support, if you know someone who's looking for professional support, reach out to us. We're here. We want to help. And we have the skills to know how to help. And so never hesitate. We are here for you, and we want to be here for you. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending today's webinar. We will be uploading this video onto YouTube so you can share it with others who weren't able to make it. And on our YouTube channel, we also have all of our other webinars. And so if this is the first one you're attending, welcome. And feel free to check out the other webinars that we have in the hopes that this will be helpful for you and this will be a positive experience. We look forward to growing with you and to increasing positive mental health in our community. Thanks, everyone.